Let me tell you about Thanksgiving. I don't like when people make food at their house and then bring it to my house, right?
I understand.
It's always leaking, you know? There's like a trail from their car to my kitchen.
Okay.
And it's always unidentifiable. They gotta explain what it is. They're like, it's a family recipe. It's a little cinnamon pecan chicken. I'm always wondering where to put it. I put it near the garbage.
Good morning. It's Monday, Cold War Monday, January the 12th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Varney and Company, motivation, meditation, and the Cold War. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, Varney and Company.
Dina Powell McCormick will be the new president of that company, as we told you earlier. That'll do it for us for Monday. Thanks so much for being here. Have a great day. We're going to see you again tomorrow, and we will continue to ramp up the coverage on fourth quarter earnings with the major banks reporting. Varney and Company picks it up. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. This came as a real shock to the financial world. Federal prosecutors have launched a criminal investigation against the Federal Reserve. It's all about cost overruns for the renovations of the Federal Reserve's building. Renovation project, I should say. Jay Powell has abandoned his usual silence in the face of criticism and has come out swinging. In a brief video, he said it was all political. He calls the investigation intimidation. The situation is unprecedented. If a grand jury believes there's evidence to support the charges, the chair of the Federal Reserve could face a criminal indictment. President Trump told NBC he knows nothing about it. Investors do not like this. Stocks down across the board. Interest rates are up and precious metals, they're up as well. Look at this. The Dow Industrials down about 300 points at the open. The Nasdaq off about 200. The 10-year Treasury yield, that's coming in at 4.19%, just shy of 420. The 2-year, well above 3.5%. You're looking at 354 right now. And gold, here's the news, $4,622 per ounce. That is up 2.7%, $121 higher, just like that. Silver, well above $80 an ounce. It has reached 85.33. That is up 7.5%. Not much change for Bitcoin. It's holding around $90,000. On the show today, Iran on the brink. 500 reported dead in protests against the Islamic government. There were chants of death to the dictator. That would be the Ayatollah Khomeini. President Trump says the Iranians are beginning to cross some red lines. He's preparing what he calls strong options. Cuba on the brink. The president says the regime in Havana should make a deal before it's too late. The seizure of Venezuelan oil has cut Cuba's lifeline. Violent demonstrations around the country. In Los Angeles, a U-Haul truck was driven into a crowd protesting against Iran and the Iranian government. The driver was arrested. DHS's Kristi Noem not backing down. She's sending an extra 1,000 ICE agents to Minneapolis. An ugly scene in New York. Jews attending an Israeli real estate event at a synagogue harassed. Jewish attendees, they were chanting, the demonstrators were chanting, "Long live October 7th." Meanwhile, employees are threatening an Israeli bakery chain that operates in New York. They say they want to end the company's support of the, quote, genocide happening in Palestine. Zoran Mandami has been mayor for just over a week. It's not going well. It is Monday, January the 12th, 2026.
And that was Varney and Company, Nonprofit News Now. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little motivation.
I don't know a single person who wakes up every single day and says, dude, I can't wait. I can't wait to go get my ass kicked.
It sucks to get up in the morning time. It was raining like cats and dogs. I want to get my shoes on and go run. But guess what? I got my shit on and ran. Why do you think I run? I hate doing it more than anything. It's the one thing I hate the most to do, and I do it like I love it. Why is that? Because if you can get through to doing things that you hate to do, on the other side is greatness. By me running, I am callous in my mind. I'm not training for a race. I'm training for life. So you want to get to the point in your life where all these things that you don't do, they bother you. They haunt you. They eat at you throughout the whole day. If you miss something that you were supposed to do, if you're like, you know what, it's not a big deal, I'll do it tomorrow. You're not there yet. You want to get to the point in your life where everything that you should have done and you didn't do, it bothers you.
You have to have the attitude of a fucking warrior. It is not easy. It is not for everybody. It takes more than what everybody else is trying to give, which is why nobody else has it. But if you can teach yourself to be disciplined and you can teach yourself to not quit, you cannot lose as long as you keep going. And if you stop, if you falter, if you don't follow through, What's your life going to look like if you don't do it? What's your life going to look like if you don't fucking go out and build what the fuck you want to build? What are you going to feel like if you don't go do that? What are you going to feel like in a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, when you die? What are you going to be saying? Because I can promise you, bro, that dream ain't going away. It is your purpose. And for you to go build that, it's going to require executing when you don't fucking feel like it. It doesn't matter if I'm tired or if I don't feel like it, bro. I have to do it. Do you have the capacity to execute at a high standard when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it? Because when you don't feel like it is when everybody else quits. And that is when you widen the gap between yourself and everybody else.
You really about this or not? Do you really want this or not? You can't just say you want it. It's cute to say it. But when it's showtime, when the sun comes out, what separates you from everybody else is that when it's time to hunt, you ready to hunt. If you don't give extreme effort on Monday, and then you give it on Tuesday, and then you don't give it on Wednesday, you just taking an axe and just swinging it. And you wonder why you're not getting the results you want. Because what real winners do is sharpen the axe first, and then they don't just hit the tree 1,000 times. They hit the tree 1,000 times in the same spot. You hitting it all over the place. You are losing control, and it's time to take control. No, you really don't feel like it. You really don't need to do it. You don't really need to read anything. Forget all that. That's that inner conversation. When that inner dialogue starts, you have got to shut it down and say, I'm going to do it anyway. Successful people do what they have to do, whether they feel like it or not. I didn't feel like it. I don't give a what you felt like doing. Most people don't feel like participating or growing or changing. Most people don't. Most people don't feel like it. At 5 a.m. when my alarm goes off, I don't feel like it either. But you know what? I get up because I'm a man. Because I set the freaking example. Because I'm going to win. It doesn't matter how you feel. It doesn't matter if you're tired. It doesn't matter if you're overwhelmed. You find out a fucking way to overcome that challenge, and you make that shit happen. And your brain's going, I don't know, I'm really not developing. I really don't feel like doing it. I'm really tired. That's the thoughts. But the directive is shoes on, gym, now. And those are conscious directives. And the more you give yourself conscious directives, the more over time you teach yourself to override your feelings. And once you teach yourself to override your feelings, you've got superpowers compared to most people. Discipline is what gets things done. The biggest challenge that you will have in life is you.
I don't negotiate with myself. There's no discussion. This is what we're going to do right now. This is a unified force. We're going to go, oh, wait, I'm not ready. Or let me count to 10. Or maybe I'll do it tomorrow. That pattern of thinking is what destroys most people's lives and their dreams. You can settle for a life like most people have where you can create your dreams. But to do it, you need to be able to push yourself. So you need to train yourself in little ways. Going and lifting weights. And you're going to do like 10 minutes of pushing yourself. Or a sprint. Anything. Because when you push beyond what's comfortable, it develops this determination inside you, this sense of will that you will then use everywhere else. If you discipline yourself in one area of your life, you're going to be able to do it even more in other areas. You get.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now some meditation. and that's a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Cold War.
October 6th, 1973. 1400 hours. Deep beneath the surface, the Syrian General Staff was orchestrating an apocalypse. To the Soviet advisors standing quietly in the corners of the room, this was not just a regional conflict. This was the ultimate field test. For years, the Soviet Union had poured billions of rubles, their most advanced armor, and their rigid tactical doctrine into the Syrian Arab army. They had built a machine designed to crush Western resistance through pure, mathematical inevitability. On the situation map, the logic was flawless. To the north, on the Golan Heights, the equation was simple. 1,400 Syrian tanks were revving their engines. Facing them, scattered across the rocky volcanic plateau, were fewer than 180 Israeli tanks. The ratio was nearly 10 to 1. In specific breakthrough sectors, it was closer to 15 to 1. A Soviet senior military advisor, let us call him Colonel Volkov, watched the markers move on the map. He checked his watch. The sun was setting. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The Israeli reservists were at home, fasting. Their radios were silent, their guard was down. According to the Soviet wargaming models run in Moscow, the Syrian armored columns should sweep across the Golan and reach the Jordan River within 24 hours. There was no variable in the equation that allowed for defeat. The sheer mass of Soviet steel was a physical law that could not be broken. The offensive began with an artillery barrage that turned the horizon into a wall of fire. Then, the steel tsunami rolled forward. 3 massive infantry divisions, spearheaded by hundreds of T-55 tanks and the brand new, terrifying T-62 tanks, crossed the purple line. For the first 6 hours, the mood in the Damascus bunker was professional, bordering on jubilant. The reports flowed in. The Israeli minefields were breached. The anti-tank ditches were bridged. The sheer weight of the offensive was crushing the thin line of defenders. Volkov nodded approvingly. The T-62 tank, with its 115mm smoothbore gun, was superior to anything the Israelis possessed on paper. It had better armor, and, crucially, it had modern active infrared night vision systems. The Israelis did not. As night fell over the Golan, the Syrian advantage should have become absolute. The Soviet advisors expected the Israeli defense to collapse into chaos under the cover of darkness. But as midnight approached on October 6th, the rhythm of the teleprinters changed. The reports coming from the 7th Infantry Division in the northern sector were inconsistent. They were not reporting a breakthrough. They were reporting heavy resistance. Volkov frowned. Resistance? From whom? Intelligence stated there was barely a battalion of tanks facing them in that sector. The mathematics said those Israeli tanks should have been overwhelmed, flanked, and destroyed by volume of fire hours ago. Then, a frantic voice transmission crackled over the radio network, intercepted and relayed to the command center. It was a Syrian battalion commander from the lead echelon. He was screaming. He claimed he was taking fire from phantom tanks. He reported that his lead company of 10 tanks had been liquidated in less than 2 minutes. Liquidated? A Syrian general asked, grabbing the handset. By air support? Is the Israeli Air Force active? No air support. The voice crackled back, panic rising in the pitch. Direct fire. Long range. We cannot see them. They are shooting us from the darkness. They are hitting us from 3,000 meters. The bunker fell silent. Volkov exchanged a worried glance with his colleagues. This was technically impossible. The battle was taking place in pitch blackness. The Israelis were operating older Western tanks, modified Centurions and Patterns. These machines did not possess the technology to engage targets effectively at 3,000 meters in daylight, let alone at night without infrared searchlights. And yet, the reports kept coming. 1 T-55 tank destroyed, then another, then an entire platoon of T-62 tanks burning. By dawn on October 7th, the confusion had curdled into a cold dread. The map did not look right. The red markers representing the Syrian offensive were not sweeping down to the Sea of Galilee. They were bunching up, stalling in a narrow corridor that would soon be known as the Valley of Tears. The Soviet advisors began pulling technical schematics. They scrutinized the data on the Israeli order of battle. They looked for the presence of secret weapons. Had the Americans shipped a new guided missile system overnight? Were there NATO mercenaries in the turrets? The numbers were horrifying. In one sector, a single platoon of 4 Israeli tanks was holding back an entire Syrian brigade. The Syrians would crest a ridge, expecting to find the enemy routed, only to be met with devastatingly accurate fire that targeted the weak points of their armor, the turret rings, the fuel cells. The precision was surgical. It was mechanical murder. The confusion in the bunker deepened when reconnaissance photos arrived later that morning. They showed the battlefield. It was a graveyard. Dozens, then scores, then hundreds of Soviet-supplied tanks lay smoking on the basalt rocks. Their turrets were blown off. Their hulls were blackened. Volkov stared at the grainy images. He saw the wreckage of the Soviet Union's best export technology. The T-62 tank was designed to be the apex predator of the battlefield. It was low profile, heavily armored, and packed a punch that could penetrate any NATO tank. Yet here, in the Golan, they were being slaughtered by tall, boxy, clumsy-looking tanks that looked like relics from the 1950s. It defies logic. One of the junior analysts muttered, tracing the line of destroyed vehicles. The Israelis are outnumbered 14-1. Their tanks are slower. They have smaller guns. They have no night vision. How are they stopping the advance? This is the question that haunts military historians and haunted the Kremlin in 1973. How does a force that should be mathematically extinct stop an unstoppable object? The answer lay not just in the metal, but in a secret adaptation, a ghost in the machine that the Soviets had completely overlooked. Before we dive into the mystery of the Valley of Tears and the investigation that followed, if you want to understand the hidden mechanics of global conflict and the untold stories of military history, make sure you subscribe to Cold War Impact. We decode the declassified files to show you how the world really works. Back in Damascus, the situation was spiraling. The Syrian commanders were accusing their tank crews of cowardice. The tank crews were accusing their commanders of sending them into a trap. But the Soviet advisors knew better. They knew the Syrian crews were brave. They were dying in their hundreds, pressing the attack. The problem was something else. By the afternoon of October 7th, a new report arrived from the front. A Syrian recovery vehicle had managed to drag a disabled Israeli tank back to their lines before being forced to retreat. It was a Centurion, but it looked wrong. The barrel was different. The engine deck was modified. It was covered in strange reactive plates and stowage boxes. Volkov ordered the technical team to the front immediately. They needed to see this machine. They needed to understand what was killing their T-62 tanks before the entire offensive collapsed. They had to know if this was a new American superweapon or something else entirely. As they prepared to leave Damascus for the front lines, the artillery thunder in the distance grew louder. The Israelis weren't just holding. They were starting to push back. The Soviet doctrine relied on mass. It relied on the idea that quantity has a quality all its own. But in the volcanic dust of the Golan Heights, that quality was failing. The advisors were about to step into a crime scene where the victim was their own ideology and the killer was a mystery wrapped in British steel and American engineering. October 8th, 1973, the Northern Sector. Colonel Volkov stood at the edge of the plateau, the wind whipping dust and the acrid smell of diesel fuel into his face. He was no longer in the comfortable abstraction of the Damascus bunker. He was a few kilometers from the front line, at a chaotic staging area where the remnants of the Syrian 7th Infantry Division were trying to regroup. What he saw defied the laws of military science. The Syrian army was equipped with the T-55 and T-62 tanks. These were low-slung, aggressive machines designed to present the smallest possible target to the enemy. They were the embodiment of the Soviet philosophy. Hard to hit, harder to kill. In contrast, the British-made Centurion, the tank the Israelis were using, was a dinosaur. It was tall, boxy, and flat-sided. It should have been a magnet for armor-piercing rounds. Volkov grabbed a terrified Syrian tank commander, a lieutenant who had just walked back from the front line on foot, his face black with soot. "Tell me what you saw," Volkov demanded through a translator. "How are they hitting you? You have the night vision. You have the numbers." The lieutenant's eyes were wide, staring at something Volkov couldn't see. "We don't see them until we burn," he whispered. "We turn on the infrared searchlights to find a target. We scan the darkness. We see nothing. But the moment we turn on the light, a shell hits us. It is as if the light attracts the bullet." Volkov cursed. The T-62 tanks utilized active infrared. To see in the dark, they had to project a beam of infrared light invisible to the naked eye, but visible to anyone with a viewing device. But the Israelis didn't have infrared viewers. Intelligence was certain of this. So how were the Israelis targeting a T-62 tank the instant it turned on its spotlight? It was as if the Israelis could see the invisible beam. The mystery deepened when Volkov examined the damage on a T-55 tank that had been towed back to the rear. The entry hole was small, clean, and terrifyingly precise. It wasn't a random hit. The shell had pierced the turret ring, the chaotic, moving joint between the body and the gun. He was moving, the mechanic explained, gesturing to the ruined tank. This tank was moving at 30 kilometers per hour over rocks, and he was hit in the turret ring. To make that shot, the Israeli gunner would have to calculate the lead, the drop, and the bounce of his own tank perfectly in a split second. Volkov ran his hand over the cold steel. The Soviet doctrine relied on the stop-to-fire method. To shoot accurately, a T-55 tank usually had to halt. This made them vulnerable. But the reports claimed the Israelis were firing while maneuvering, or firing from positions that seemed geometrically impossible. The terrain of the Golan is not a flat plain. It is a nightmare of volcanic ridges, sudden drops, and basalt boulders. It is tank-killing country. The Soviet advisors had warned the Syrians that this terrain favored the defender, but they had calculated that the T-62 tank's superior power-to-weight ratio would allow them to swarm the obstacles. Instead, the terrain had become a weapon. Reports were coming in of pop-up attacks. A Syrian column would be advancing through a wadi, a dry riverbed. Suddenly, the turret of an Israeli tank would appear over the crest of a ridge, fire a shot that destroyed the lead tank, and then vanish backward before the Syrians could return fire. It is like fighting ghosts. The Syrian general complained, slamming his fist on the hood of a jeep. Our guns cannot elevate enough to hit them on the high ridges, and they cannot depress enough to hit them when we are above them. They are dancing around us. Volkov looked at the map again. The Valley of Tears. That's what the soldiers were calling the breakthrough sector now. In a space of just a few kilometers, hundreds of Syrian tanks were burning. The smoke was so thick, it was creating an artificial twilight. But the most baffling piece of intelligence came from a radio interception recorded an hour prior. An Israeli company commander, codenamed Zvika, was heard coordinating his unit. The Soviet analysts listened to the tape, confused. He is ordering tanks to move to position Aleph, then position Bet, the analyst said. But, Colonel, listen to the background noise. We hear only one engine. We hear only one gun firing. Volkov listened. The analyst was right. It sounded like a single tank rushing back and forth, firing like a maniac, pretending to be a platoon. One tank? Volkov asked, incredulous. You are telling me one tank is holding up a brigade? It seems so. Or he is moving so fast our crews think they are surrounded. The Soviet military worldview was crumbling. They believed in the collective, the battalion, the regiment. The idea that individual crew skill or a specific mechanical quirk could override mass formations was heresy. Yet, the evidence was piling up in the burning wrecks of the T-62 tanks. There was something about the Israeli tank itself that they were missing. Volkov remembered the dossier on the Centurion. It was developed in 1945. It was underpowered. Its range was short. By 1973, it should have been obsolete. Why was it moving with such agility in the volcanic rock? Why was it not overheating? Why was its rate of fire nearly double that of the T-62 tank? A disturbing thought entered Volkov's mind. The T-62 tank used a massive 115mm round. The brass casing was heavy. The interior of the tank was cramped, terribly cramped. To load the gun, the loader had to wrestle the shell into the breech, while the gun automatically ejected the spent casing. It was a violent, dangerous dance inside a steel box. After a few hours of combat, the Syrian loaders were exhausted. Their rate of fire dropped to 2 or 3 rounds per minute. The Israelis were reportedly firing 6, maybe 8 rounds per minute, and they had been fighting for 48 hours straight. We need to see inside one of their tanks, Volkov said, his voice low. Not a burnt-out hull. I need a functioning machine. I need to see the engine. I need to see the gun sights. As evening fell on October 8th, the tide began to turn, but not in the way the Soviets expected. The Syrians were running out of morale before they ran out of tanks. The Valley of Tears was choked with the dead, and still the thin line of old boxy tanks on the ridge held firm. Volkov looked through his binoculars at the distant muzzle flashes on the horizon. He realized he wasn't watching a battle of numbers, he was watching a collision of philosophies, and the Soviet philosophy was bleeding to death. The mystery was no longer about if the offensive would fail. It was about what exactly was inside those Israeli tanks that turned them into rapid-fire snipers. Was it a computer? A new American autoloader? The answer would arrive the next morning in the form of a captured Shot-Kal tank, towed away from the battlefield by a desperate Syrian recovery team. When Volkov finally climbed inside the enemy turret, what he found would shock him not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. October 9th, 1973, the crisis point. The battle for the Valley of Tears had raged for 3 days and 3 nights. The sheer volume of fire had ground the basalt rocks into fine grey powder. Colonel Volkov was now stationed at a forward observation post, looking through a high-powered periscope. Beside him, the Syrian division commander was pale, his hands shaking as he held a radio handset. The mathematics of war had finally caught up with the Israelis. Of the roughly 100 tanks that had started the defense of this sector, barely 20 remained operational. The Syrian 7th Infantry Division, reinforced by the Republican Guard T-62 tanks, was preparing for the final hammer blow. They had pushed the battered Israeli defenders to the very edge of the escarpment. There was nowhere left for the Zionists to retreat. Behind them was a steep drop into the Sea of Galilee. "This is it," the Syrian commander muttered. "They are out of ammunition. They are out of fuel. We will wash them into the lake." Volkov watched the T-62 tanks rumble forward. It was a magnificent sight, a wave of armor advancing up the slope. But as he watched, he noticed something peculiar, a geometric anomaly that made his stomach turn. The Syrian tanks were attacking uphill. To engage the Israeli tanks dug in on the ridge, the T-62 gunners had to elevate their massive 115mm guns. But as they crested the steep lava ridges, they encountered a fatal flaw in Soviet design engineering, one that had never appeared on the flat testing grounds of Russia or the deserts of Egypt. To keep the T-62 tank low and difficult to hit, Soviet engineers had flattened the turret. This meant there was very little room inside for the breech of the gun to move up and down. Consequently, the T-62 tank had a terrible gun depression. It could barely aim downward. Volkov watched in horror as a company of T-62 tanks crested a ridge. They were now face to face with the surviving Israeli centurions hidden in the rocks below them. The Syrian gunners frantically tried to crank their guns down to shoot the enemy. But the barrels hit the mechanical stops. They were pointing uselessly over the heads of the Israeli tanks. The Syrian tanks were exposed, silhouetted against the sky, unable to bring their weapons to bear. Conversely, the obsolete Israeli tanks displayed a terrifying flexibility. Their tall, boxy turrets allowed their guns to tilt far downward 10 degrees of depression compared to the meager 4 or 5 degrees of the Soviet tanks. The Israelis could hide their entire hull behind a rock, tip their gun barrel over the edge, and fire into the exposed bellies of the Syrian tanks as they crested the hill. "They are shooting us from the ground up," the Syrian commander screamed. It was a massacre of geometry. The superior Soviet tank was blind to what was right in front of it. But even with this tactical advantage, the sheer numbers were overwhelming. The Israelis were down to 6 or 7 tanks in the central sector. The Syrian force still numbered in the hundreds. Then, the twist occurred the moment that is studied in every war college from West Point to Moscow. Just as the Syrian forces were about to overrun the final ridge, a victory that was minutes away, the Israeli commander, Lieutenant Colonel Avigdor Kahalani, did the unthinkable. Instead of retreating or digging in for a final stand, he ordered his handful of surviving tanks to charge. "Charge?" Volkov whispered, watching the dust clouds. "He is attacking a division with a platoon?" It was a bluff of historic proportions. The surviving Israeli tanks surged forward, firing their machine guns and cannons frantically. To the exhausted, terrified Syrian crews, who had seen hundreds of their comrades burn over the last 3 days, this didn't look like a desperate last stand. It looked like a fresh counterattack. The Syrian nerve broke. Convinced that fresh Israeli reserves had arrived, which they had not, and unable to effectively target the hull-down tanks due to the elevation issues, the Syrian lead elements began to reverse. The reverse turned into a retreat. The retreat turned into a rout. Volkov slammed his fist against the bunker wall. "Stop them! They have nothing left! You are winning!" But it was too late. The wall of steel was receding. 1,400 tanks had been stopped by a force that, by all rights, should have been dead 2 days ago. Later that afternoon, the battlefield fell into an eerie silence. The Valley of Tears was a smoking ruin. The immediate threat was over, but for Volkov and the Soviet technical team, the real work was just beginning. They had to understand the machine that had beaten them. The recovery team had finally dragged the captured Israeli tank, the one Volkov had requested, into a secure garage behind Syrian lines. It was a Shotkal, the Israeli name for the upgraded Centurion. Volkov circled the beast. It looked battered. The paint was scorched. But as he climbed onto the engine deck, he realized the Western tank was a lie. This wasn't the British tank they knew from World War II. "Open the engine bay," Volkov ordered. The mechanics unlatched the heavy steel covers. Volkov expected to see the erratic, flammable Meteor petrol engine that the British had originally installed, an engine known for catching fire if you looked at it wrong. Instead, he stared at a massive, air-cooled American monster. "It's a diesel," the chief mechanic said, wiping grease from his hands. "A Teledyne Continental AVDS, American-made." Volkov realized instantly why the Israeli tanks hadn't burned as easily as the T-55 tanks. Diesel fuel is much harder to ignite than petrol. The Israelis had taken a British chassis and transplanted an American heart into it. "And the transmission?" Volkov asked. "Allison CD 850. Automatic. Like a luxury car." Volkov felt a chill. The Soviet T-55 and T-62 tanks required brute strength to drive. The drivers had to hammer the gears with a sledgehammer sometimes. They were exhausted after 2 hours. The Israeli drivers, with this American automatic transmission, could drive for 24 hours with one hand on the yoke. They weren't just fighting better, they were fresher. But the engine was just the beginning. Volkov climbed into the turret. This was where the true secret lay. The thing that allowed a single tank to destroy a platoon in minutes. He squeezed into the commander's seat and looked at the breech of the gun. It wasn't the gun itself that shocked him. It was what was missing. "Where is the computer?" Volkov asked. "Where is the autoloader?" There was none. It was primitive. Manual cranks. A human loader. "How?" Volkov whispered. "How did they shoot faster than our autoloader?" He looked at the floor of the turret. It was covered in spent brass casings. He looked at the layout of the ammunition racks. And then he saw the modification that changed everything. The Israelis hadn't added technology. They had removed it. They had stripped the tank down to maximize the one thing the Soviets had neglected, the human factor. The shock was waiting for him in the gunner's sight. He put his eye to the rubber eyepiece. What he saw through the glass would explain why the Syrians felt they were fighting ghosts in the dark. It wasn't magic. It was a piece of stolen technology that the Soviets had been warned about, but had arrogantly dismissed. October 10th, 1973. Behind Syrian lines. Colonel Volkov pressed his eye against the rubber rim of the Israeli gunner's sight. He expected to see a sophisticated electronic computer display, something that would explain the supernatural accuracy of the Zionist fire. He expected glowing red reticles, digital rangefinders, or perhaps a thermal overlay technology that the KGB rumors said the Americans were testing in Nevada. Instead, he saw a piece of glass. It was shocking in its banality. The sight picture was clear, incredibly clear, but it was analog. There were no dancing lights. Just a simple stadiometric rangefinder, a set of lines used to estimate distance based on the size of the target. It was almost identical to the sights used in World War II. Volkov pulled back, confused. "This is it?" he asked the Syrian engineer. "This is the ghost technology? It is a telescope." "Look closer, Colonel," the engineer said, pointing to the ammunition rack next to the loader's station. "It is not how they see, it is what they throw." Volkov moved to the ammo rack. He pulled out a heavy, sleek projectile. It didn't look like the explosive shells the Soviet tanks fired. The Soviet T-62 tank fired two main types of rounds: high explosive anti-tank, heat, and steel armor-piercing rounds. This Israeli round was different. It was the M392 APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot. Volkov held the round, and suddenly, the physics of the Valley of Tears clicked into place. This was the secret. This was the killer. The Soviet doctrine relied on the concept of slope. The T-55 and T-62 tanks were designed with heavily sloped frontal armor. The idea was that a traditional steel shell would hit the slope and bounce off, or ricochet. It was a shield built on the laws of angles. But the APDS round in Volkov's hand was a cheat code against physics. The engineer explained, "It is a dart, Colonel. Wrapped in a shoe, a sabot. When it leaves the barrel, the shoe falls off. The dart travels at 1400 meters per second. It is made of tungsten carbide. It concentrates all the kinetic energy of a massive gun into a point the size of a coin. Volkov realized the horror of the situation. The APDS round didn't care about the slope of the T-62 armor. It moved so fast and was so dense that it didn't bounce. It punched through the sloped steel like a needle through fabric. The invincible frontal armor of the T-62, which gave the Syrian crews so much confidence, was paper to this weapon. And the gun that fired it. Volkov looked at the breech again. Stamped into the metal was the designation, Royal Ordnance L7. This was the twist that made Volkov's blood run cold. The L7 gun wasn't American. It was British. And it had been born from a Soviet mistake years ago. In 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, a Soviet T-54 tank had been driven onto the grounds of the British Embassy in Budapest by panicked rebels. The British had briefly examined it, realized their current guns couldn't penetrate its armor, and immediately developed the L7 specifically to kill Soviet tanks. The Syrians were being destroyed by a weapon designed 15 years ago specifically to hunt them. But the mystery of the night battle remained, the ghost attacks. How did the Israelis see the T-62 tanks in the dark without infrared gear? Volkov climbed out of the turret and walked to the front of the captured tank. He looked for the infrared searchlight. There wasn't one. Instead, mounted above the main gun, was a massive, boxy, xenon searchlight. They have white light, Volkov noted. Visible light. If they turn this on, they reveal their position to the whole world. It is suicide. They didn't use the lights, Colonel. A survivor from the 7th Division spoke up. He was a platoon commander, bandaged and smoking a cigarette nearby. They used our lights. Volkov froze. Explain. We were taught to use the active infrared, the commander said bitterly. We turn on the IR spotlight. We look through our scope. We see the world in green. But the beam is a flashlight. Volkov understood instantly. The Soviet active IR technology was a trap. To see, the Syrian tank had to project a beam of infrared light. To the human eye, it is invisible. But to anyone with a basic passive night viewer, or even just looking closely at the source, the emitter glows a dull, angry red. And worse, when dozens of Syrian tanks turned on their IR beams in the dusty, smoky air of the Golan, the beams crossed. They illuminated the dust. They created a silhouette effect. The Israelis, sitting in the dark, didn't need to see the tanks. They just aimed at the source of the invisible beams. Every time a Syrian tank commander turned on his advanced night vision to find a target, he was essentially lighting a flare over his own head that said, "I am here." The Israelis were firing at the flashlights. Volkov returned to the bunker to draft his preliminary report for Moscow. The conclusion he was writing was heresy. It contradicted everything the Communist Party taught about war. The Soviet philosophy of tank design was collectivist. The tank was a consumable asset. It was made to be small, hard to hit, and cheap to produce in massive numbers. The crew was secondary. The T-62 tank was cramped. The loader had to work in a space the size of a closet, lifting heavy shells while the gun breech recoiled inches from his chest. It was hot, loud, and terrifying. After 3 hours in a T-62 tank, a crew was physically broken. Their reaction times slowed. Their loading speed dropped to 2 rounds per minute. The Western philosophy, embodied in the Shotkal, was individualist. The tank was huge. It was a barn. But inside, it was an office. Volkov wrote furiously. The enemy tank is inferior in armor protection. It is inferior in top speed. It is a larger target. However, it possesses a decisive advantage: ergonomics. The Israeli loaders, standing on a flat turntable floor in a high-roofed turret, could grab rounds easily. They weren't fighting the machine. The machine was working for them. This explained the rate of fire. While the Syrian loader was struggling to align a shell in a bouncing, cramped T-62, the Israeli loader had already fired 2 rounds. In the Valley of Tears, where the range was short and the targets were many, rate of fire was the only metric that mattered. The Israelis were putting 3 times more metal in the air than the Syrians. 100 tanks firing at 10 rounds per minute is equal to 300 tanks firing at 3 rounds per minute. The math balanced out not because of the number of tanks, but because of the number of shells downrange. There was one final detail Volkov included in his report, a detail that would eventually lead to the development of the T-72 and T-80 tanks. During the interrogation of the captured tank, the mechanics found a specific handle near the commander's seat, the commander's override. In a Soviet tank, the commander commands. The gunner shoots. If the commander sees a target, he has to yell at the gunner, "Target left, traverse left." The gunner then has to find it, aim, and fire. This loop takes seconds. Crucial, fatal seconds. In the Centurion, the commander had a joystick. If he saw a threat, he could grab the stick, override the gunner, swing the turret himself, and put the gun on target. He could practically lay the gun for the gunner. Hunter, killer capability, Volkov wrote. The Israeli commander searches for the next target while the gunner kills the current one. They are processing the battlefield twice as fast as our crews. As the war drew to a close in late October 1973, the Valley of Tears remained in Israeli hands. The Syrian army had lost over 1,000 tanks in that sector alone. The Israeli 7th Armored Brigade had been reduced to a handful of operational vehicles, but they had held the line. Volkov's report was sent to Moscow. It caused a storm in the Kremlin. The T-62 tank, the pride of the Red Army, the tank that was supposed to rush to the English Channel in a week, had been stopped by a 1,940 seconds British chassis with a new engine. The shock wasn't that the Soviet tanks were bad, it was that they were designed for the wrong kind of war. They were designed for a massive, rolling offensive across the flat plains of Europe, supported by nuclear weapons. They were not designed for a chaotic, hull-down knife fight in volcanic rocks where individual crew skill and gun depression meant more than frontal armor thickness. The mystery of the 100 stopping the 1,400 wasn't a miracle. It was a triumph of systems integration. The Israelis had taken a tank, upgraded the engine to keep the crew fresh, upgraded the gun to penetrate anything, and trained their crews to exploit the terrain. The Soviets had focused on the hard stats. Armor thickness, gun caliber, top speed. The West had won on the soft stats. Depression angle, crew comfort, rate of fire, and optical clarity. Years later, military historians would look at the Golan Heights as the graveyard of the quantity over quality doctrine. The sight of hundreds of T-62 tanks burning in the valley proved that, in modern warfare, being seen first and shooting first matters more than how many friends you brought to the fight. The Soviet advisors left Damascus quietly. They left behind a broken army and a shattered reputation, but they took with them the lessons that would build the next generation of warfare. They realized that you cannot automate victory. You still need a human in the loop, and that human needs room to breathe, a gun that can depress, and a shell that doesn't bounce. In the end, the Valley of Tears was saved not by a secret laser or a hidden missile, but by a tungsten dart and a diesel engine. The logic of the battlefield is cruel. It does not respect the price tag of the tank. It respects only the crew that remains effective when the world is burning around them.
And that was the Cold War. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.